Hi, welcome to Infinite Leaders Live, the podcast that shares real life lessons from real life people. We're really lucky, we're really fortunate to speak to inspirational people from around the world every week. People that are able to help people in organizations, in positions, regardless of role, rank, and responsibility. As usual, I'm joined by my co-host, Alan. How are you doing, Alan?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Lewis. And we're proud again to wear our Tsunami products. And Tsunami is the #1 choice for eco sportswear. And I'm really excited by today's guest, and he will certainly talk about the things you don't get taught at university or on any courses.
No, this one will be rich in detail with loads and loads of takeaways. So have your pen and paper ready. And we love your feedback, so please do get in touch with us. You can find us on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, and on all major podcast platforms, and also at theinfinitelearners.com. Be better educators, be better humans. Alan, let's get stuck in.
Great. And I get your notepads out. There's going to be some absolute gems of wisdom coming out of the show today. Daryl Nicol is a personal trainer and functional patterns movement specialist. FP is a concept that supports humans to live intentionally, not habitually. He's originally from Scotland, but now resides in Perth, Australia, where he runs his own gym, FP Perth. In a previous life, he was an electrician, and he's also a semi-professional footballer. Now, Daryl became a human biomechanics specialist in 2018, and we can't wait to hear his thoughts and interpretations on functional patterns. So welcome to the show, Daryl, and Scotland to Perth. Tell us a bit about that one.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Me and my partner Alison, we came to visit on holiday, and 2014, I think it was, and it was December, January time. So going back to Scotland in January, coming from Perth, sunshine was a bit of a shock, and purely a decision based on the weather. Really, we thought we need to get over there and live. So we made the move in 2016, and I've never looked back. Absolutely love it.
I remember the same conversation with my wife, Daryl, where we were teaching in the UK and we went over to Spain to look at a school over there. And as soon as that sun was out, I think the decision was made. Tell us a bit about that. How difficult is it though, as people who are living in the UK, and we have lots of listeners there, that decision is not to be taken lightly, is it? It's a huge, huge move. Tell us a bit about how the process to make that decision.
It is a huge decision. You're right. We got back to Scotland in January, miserable weather, and we thought give it a crack. And as big as a decision it is, and this is probably more on my part, I'm pretty good at doing these things. I'm like, what's the worst that can happen? So we get over there, we hate it, we think, oh, we've made the wrong decision. Cool, let's just move back to Scotland. Like at the end of the day, it's a huge decision. If it works out well, if it doesn't work out well, we'll just come back. So we were pretty keen. It's obviously a little bit nerve-wracking as well, but the process to get into Australia is very difficult. It was a 12-month process for us trying to get a visa. So that whole application process was pretty stressful. But with the way the world today, with what we're doing just now, and people able to fly across the world, families have been able to come out and visit us and things. So it's just been fantastic. It's something that not everybody, it's not for everybody moving locations and moving to a warmer climate, but we've certainly never looked back.
And then fast forward a few years from there, Daryl, and you were in Alabang in Manila, and I think it was 2016 where we met, wasn't it? The functional patterns biomechanics course. And for me, I was very new into reading about functional patterns at that stage, and I went to that course and it absolutely blew me away in terms of the depth of it, in terms of just the talking through of it, the sort of explanations around functional patterns. And I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I know it's difficult myself. I'm not sure how I'd answer it, but for our listeners, what is functional patterns? What makes it different to other training programs? Why isn't it maybe just a fad or a way of training that involves certain sets and reps? What sets it aside from everything else?
I think you're right. It's my answer to this probably changes daily, but I'll give it a good crack. I think on the surface, so from the outside looking in, functional patterns is, and I'll preface this by saying this is, I'm not speaking on behalf of functional patterns. I'm not employed by the company, so this is my interpretation of what functional patterns is. But on the surface, looking in, functional patterns is a training system, a training methodology that that prioritizes biomechanics as a fundamental pillar of health. We prioritize biomechanics as one of the most important aspects of health. That would be from an outsider looking in. Once you get into functional patterns and you get in deeply, it then also becomes almost a way of life, whereby changing your structure physically, i.e., then in turn changes your hormonal responses and your hormonal balance, which then in turn changes your behaviors and changes your decision making. If you go deep enough into it, it can become a point where on a second by second basis, you're then concerned about the decisions you're making always having a functional context. So every decision you make throughout your life is based around functionality. Will this help me improve as a human? And that's getting like pretty deep into it. But the actual training system itself, the theory or methodology behind it is like, if you look at and we quite often will think of ourselves as people, as Lewis, as Alan, as Daryl, the personalities, but we have to remember that we're human beings. We're a living organism. We're an animal like every other animal on the planet, and we have a long evolutionary process that's went along with that. So what functional patterns has said, like one of Naudi, the founder, his taglines is train in relation to your biological characteristics. And what I think he means by that is our physique, so the actual sculpture of our body, like the reason we have two pecs, the reason we have two glutes, the reason our muscles are formed in the way they are is because of a process of evolution, which has involved us becoming upright, standing on 2 feet, walking and running. That has happened over millions and millions of years, but that has literally sculpted how our body looks and also how it functions. So each muscle has a function to perform. So what we're saying is that during those motions, during walking, during running, and during throwing, there's a certain sequence of muscle actions happen. Those muscles, those sequences are happening, is what sculpted the formation of our body. So what we're saying is we should look to train those sequences. We should look to, i.e., if when you walk, you have one glute contracts and the opposite lat contracts. That's how a functional body should operate. What we're saying at functional patterns is we should train those sequences. So when one muscle contracts, the muscle that goes along in that sequence should also contract and drive length in other sequences as well. It sounds pretty complicated, and it is to a certain extent, but really to simplify that, we're just saying that the human body moves in a certain way, and it has moved that way for millions and millions of years. So we think that your training should revolve around those movements.
So by isolating those movements you talked there about, was it running, walking, throwing?
Yeah.
So by isolating those movements, are we suggesting, or are you suggesting there, Daryl, that optimal human performance is very much factored around those three things, and actually what's happened over time is optimal human performance that people perceive isn't essentially optimal human performance, it's optimal sporting performance, and there's clearly a difference between those two things?
100%, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The human body functions a certain way. It's just like, again, if I take it back to being an animal, it's like if you have a dog, right? Or let's say I used this example before, but let's say you owned a racehorse, and the racehorse has you've got a big race coming up, and you say to the trainer, how is it going? How's the racehorse going for this big Cheltenham race we've got coming up? And the trainer said, yeah, I've got the horse lying on its back, and it's using its front two hoofs to press something up the way. You'd be going, sorry, what? First of all, let me see that happening. But secondly, I need this horse to run. Like this horse has a certain movement pattern that's what it does. It runs. Like, so we often think of ourselves differently because, well, for whatever reason, yeah, maybe sport is a good thing to point to, but we have certain sequences within our body that is our locomotion. And yeah, we think, and it's not to say that we're just stuck to those movement patterns, but I think we've gotten so far away from those that we need to kind of reverse engineer a little bit before we can then progress to some other things.
Yeah, there seems to be a suggestion there from what you've said that the walking, running and throwing is part of our evolution. It's part of what makes us human and bipedal and different to so many other mammals. But there has been a change to human behavior over hundreds of years, you know, including things like the start of building muscle, for example, in the last 20, 30 years. Has obviously been a huge sort of social media focus. It's been a body aesthetics focus. It's very much something that people are aiming for in terms of their daily training. And that example you've just given us is quite an enlightening way of looking at it. You know, you wouldn't expect a horse that's designed to run to be doing a bench press. So how have humans got into these habits, and how, if you can speak to what some people perceive as functional movements, are often things like those core lifts, deadlifts, squats, bench presses. When you use functional movements, what are you relating to, and how have we got ourselves to this stage that we're at the moment as human beings?
I think really deeply, a thing that I kind of touched on is we've forgotten that we are this living organism, and all, like, over the last couple of decades, university degrees have kind of been built on this stuff and built on training, but really there's a lot of semantics involved in that. And what are we actually trying to achieve there? It's like, again, let's use the example of a dog. Okay, we want to make this dog bigger and stronger. We wouldn't then like isolate each individual muscle and try and like build some resistance on each muscle in a way that is totally outside of how that dog operates. So I just think we've almost forgotten that we're an animal and we have certain biological needs. Whether that goes further than movement as well, you know, in terms of your overall health. But I think we've gotten so far away from that, purely by forgetting that we need to be, that nature sees us exactly like it sees every other animal, and we can't get away with thinking we're different. I think the term functional is kind of, over the last couple of years anyway, has kind of boomed, and it's used quite a lot, but really shouldn't all, I mean, what the word functional, like to have a function, to have a purpose, isn't that the reason of all training? Like, shouldn't that, maybe if you set aside kind of the bodybuilders who I actually don't mind, because they're like, look, we have no interest in functioning, we just want to look a certain way, and it's like, yeah, cool, at least you've separated yourself. But when it comes down to like maybe the strength and conditioning field, it's like functional training shouldn't really be called functional. It's just training, you know, like to give it a term which means that it works outside of the gym. Isn't that the purpose of all training?
It's a good point, Daryl. It's a really good point. I'm just thinking about the average Joe, Daryl, who pops down to the gym and they get a fitness instructor who shows them a set of circuits on weights. They give them a bit of time to do on a treadmill, on a cross trainer. Are we saying that that's wrong then, Daryl? Should they be doing something else? I
will never say that that something is right or wrong. I've been there. I was a regular personal trainer, and I was there. I was the guy who was taking my client onto the bench press. So there's absolutely no criticism on my part in terms of what's wrong. I just think it's maybe enlightenment, or I think it's a little bit further than a different perspective. I do believe that there is a certain way the human body should be trained, or there's a certain stimulus that needs to be applied to the human body. But I definitely wouldn't say that the fault lies at the feet of the trainer. We've kind of been like clouded with so many things and so many articles and published papers and all this kind of stuff, and then a whole industry is built, and then everybody kind of just follows the same, and then it's a little bit mindless kind of we're a little bit like zombies. Like the people that are going to the gym are just going because they've heard going to the gym is good. There's not really much thought has gone into that, because everybody's busy with their own lives. Not everybody has the time to sit down and think about their own body. But I definitely think there's a lot better ways to do it. I'll say that there's a lot better, in my opinion, to do things than your stereotypical trainer in the gym taking somebody through a circuit. There's a point there to be made as well that and again, I don't blame them for not thinking about this, but if somebody has certain movement limitations, which from my experience is like almost everybody that I've came across, we have this kind of idea in our head, or generally in society, we have the idea that any sort of movement is good. So just move, just exercise. And then you have to think about, like, is that the case? Like if you do have certain movement dysfunctions that with every step you take, there's a stress response going on in your body, and then you go and try and load that step, or you go and try and, I don't know, whatever it is you're doing at the gym, you put load on top of that structure that's already compromised. Is that, like, evidently, is that a good thing? I'm not so sure.
I do want to come back to a couple of points you made there, Daryl, that I think are great for us to come back to maybe a little bit later, around the sort of idea of any movement is good. And also around that idea of, I think you use zombies as the term, of people just sort of blindly following and just going with a crowd, which I always think is a really interesting dynamic sociologically, and actually to ask questions and to consider whether that's right for you is undoubtedly the right thing. And you touched on time constraints and whether people maybe even care enough to stop and think whether it suits them. What I want to just go back a little step to a phrase you used earlier about sort of reverse engineering movement. And we touched upon those functional movements in a functional pattern sense around throwing, walking and running. And I want to know what this sort of reverse engineering looks like. So is there a suggestion that we've got ourselves into some poor or some less than ideal movement patterns as humans, and that's where you talk about movement restriction or maybe pain, if I'm right on that context. And then once you're in that pain and you're in that limited sort of movement area, whether it's through pain in joints or whether it's through issues with hormonal changes or whatever it is, there's some sort of problem that's stopping you moving well. What does that reverse engineering process that then I imagine allows you to lay foundations to move in a better way, what does that look like? Can you start to articulate that in some way?
Yeah, I'll try my best. It's a very difficult process, but let me say this. Let's say, and I'll try and explain this as like simply as possible. Let's say you're dealing with somebody who has a certain posture. Okay, right? So let's say we call it an anterior pelvic tilt. So let's say their pelvis is tilted forwards, which usually means their hip flexor muscles are going to be contracted in chronically tight. So they just always have contracted hip flexors. So it doesn't matter what they're doing, if they're walking, if they're squatting, if they're whatever movement they're doing, they're using their hip flexors. Those hip flexors are contracted the whole time. Now, a muscle needs to go through a length potential and a contractile potential to operate functionally. So if those hip flexors are always on, it means you're using them for every single movement that you do. So what we do is we take people through these slow corrective exercise, whereby we'll get them to perform a movement, and we'll communicate to them the way we want them to move their body so that their hip flexors are forced into a lengthened position whilst maintaining structural integrity in the rest of the body. So it's not to say that, okay, your hip flexors are super tight, let's just stretch them. We need to think about the actual operation of the human body. So again, just stop me if this is just sounding like I'm babbling on a little bit. But if you think about a joint in your body, okay, so I'll use my elbow joint. You can see that. If for me to stretch my tricep, I need to contract my bicep. So that there's a relationship there. If I extend my elbow, that lengthens my bicep and that contracts my tricep. So there's a relationship there. So when we're talking about taking a hip flexor and asking it to become lengthened, we need to work out where we need to contract in the body to lengthen that hip flexor. And that's why we have a little bit of a gripe against maybe your traditional forms of stretching, whereby you would, if you were going to stretch that tricep, you would maybe pull this hand down. Now, when I do that, I've completely lost my bicep contraction. I've now distorted the relationship between bicep and tricep. So what we're saying is a muscle, the length in the muscle should always be driven by a contraction elsewhere in the body. So what we do with people who have, in whatever the movement limitation is, the example I gave was tight hip flexors, we'll hold their bodies or ask them to hold their bodies in certain positions, which allows us to lengthen those hip flexors whilst driving that from a contraction elsewhere. These movements are always derived from walking, running, or throwing.
So can I ask a question on that then? So in terms of that example of the hip flexor, what you're not trying to do, if I understand rightly, is stretch that hip flexor in isolation without any sort of rhyme or any, sorry, not rhyme or reason, but any sort of thought around the effect of the rest of the body. So your usual, let's grab our foot behind our hips and really yank on our leg and stretch our quad sort of stretch, it would be out of the question in this sort of context. Exactly, because what you're doing there is you're taking away the hamstring contraction. So when you contract your hamstring, that should drive length in your quad. Remember, I'll go back to being animals. Like, stretching of muscles should happen if our bodies are operating optimally. If you watch a dog sprint at the park, he gets that stretch in the muscle and he gets a contraction in the muscle. So stretching should happen if we're moving optimally. Yeah. So what we try and do is take people through optimal ranges of movement and try and lengthen those tissues that are overly contracted, as an example, trying to drive that from muscle contractions. So you're driving what you call that length potential, but also understanding that there's a wider system that affects that. You're not just trying to isolate that down to one muscle, you're respecting the fact that that's a full body sort of function. Absolutely, yeah. So with that in mind, would this be an example where if you do a deep lunge, you might feel that in your quad? When I do a deep lunge, I might feel that in my glute, but actually it should do both. It should do your hamstring as well. It should do all three. Would that be where maybe these tight hip flexors have a sort of real life context or a fitness-based context? Great example. And that leads you to the kind of like this semantics of exercise, if you like. Like, let's say you go to see a health professional with a certain issue, and they administer that you do 10 lunges, 3 sets, and you do that a couple of times a week. For the exact point you made there, you, Lewis, take that program away and you do your lunges and you're just feeling all quad, and you're like, okay. Alan takes that same program away and he gets it all in the glute. How is that exercise the same exercise? Like, you're activating a completely opposite muscle group, but yet that exercise has been programmed to fix whatever movement limitation you had. So the fact that we kind of like put this notion on certain exercises, like that's what will fix us, like this, that even functional patterns, like the techniques are fantastic, but
it's 100% about the application of those techniques. So the specificity is what will solve the problem. If you just take away an exercise and just go through that ranges of motion of the exercise, but you're feeling it in a completely different muscle group, then what are we doing? We're just randomly moving. Do you know what I mean by that?
Yeah, no, I am. Alan, you take over here, because I'm aware I've got some sort of background knowledge of functional patterns, and I know that for a lot of this is the first time that you've heard some of it.
Yeah, I'm blown away by it. I've got a surface level knowledge of it, and
yep.
I remember, I don't know if you've read the book by Chris McDougall, where it's Natural Born Heroes, about the guys who were in Crete in the Second World War, and they were running across mountains. These are the Greek the Cretians. They're a special breed apparently from this book, and they were used to running barefoot across the mountains. Very little water, very little food, and they were outrunning soldiers. The Germans couldn't catch them at that point, and they put this down to this evolution of they can just run really well because they're used to the terrain. Biomechanically, they're absolutely unbelievable. And for me here, it's how do we get this across to the normal person, Daryl? This is where I'm at with this. And I'm sure my wife won't mind me using her as an example. She wants to get fitter. She'll go to the gym. She'll go for a walk. But how does she get this functional movement pattern into simplifying it for her to make sure she's moving properly? Because there's no point going to the gym if you're not moving properly.
100%, yeah. And this is where I'll shamelessly plug functional patterns here. The system that the founder Naudi Aguilar has created does exactly that. It gets the first step is if you don't have a practitioner that you can go and work with and learn this sort of stuff, is they have an online 10-week course, and he literally breaks it down right to the foundations, whereby it starts off with some myofascial release, where you're just releasing tissues, essentially making yourself more supple to get into these positions that we look at.
Literally breaks it down.
Yeah. And then it looks at like the foundation. So how to actually, the core is kind of something that's been, especially in the fitness industry, everybody talks about the core. You need a strong core, but like at FP, it's done so detailed that the reason for having that special core is even that strong core, is even broken down to the point where the way we perform a plank, which is, I mean, the plank is got to be one of the most used exercises out there, out with functional patterns. Everybody uses it, but the difference between a plank and FP and the traditional plank is almost a great indicator of the whole difference of our mindset compared to the traditional mindset. So when we take a client, when I take a client through a plank, we're literally being so specific in terms of holding their spine in a neutral position, trying to get their core to hold their spine in that neutral position, which if you get that perfectly, you're talking between 5 and 10 seconds before you start to kind of lose that form. The mindset elsewhere, I think, has been a case of like, let's just fatigue that core. Like that's all we're concentrating on, is feeling the burn in that core, but forgetting that the purpose of the exercise is to train the core to hold the spine in a neutral position. So the second you drop out of that neutral position, you're then training your core to hold your spine in that non-neutral position. So the premise of the 10-week course is also like a change of thought in terms of how we even view exercise. So not just trying to fatigue muscles, not just trying to expel our kind of pent up energy, actually having a purpose. And that's where the tagline, train intentionally, not habitually. It's everything is done with intention. What are we trying to achieve by this one exercise? Instead of just, let's try and burn some calories.
So often talk to us about that fatigue versus sort of progress relationship. Often people go to the gym and I've been one of these people, certainly not so much in the last couple of years, but before, you'd hit the gym 4 or 5 times a week. You'd try and do that around the sport that you're playing. And you went literally with the intention of, I'm going to work as hard as I can in this next 45 minutes, because that's the amount of time I've got. I'm going to make sure I'm really tired, and I'm going to feel good about that afterwards. And don't get me wrong, I certainly did, until I started to get some of these twinges and pains that start to direct you towards looking at alternative ideas of where you're going to go with fitness and movement. Tell us about that relationship. Well, why is fatigue not necessarily an indicator of progress, or delayed fatigue an indicator of progress?
Well, I think just going back to a point you made about training, 3-4 times a week and things, I think from my perspective, I think that most people, because we've been told, exercise is good, but I look at it and I look at other animals and I'm like, I think most humans are dealing with a stress level that's fairly high, maybe like a consumption level that's fairly high as well. Then we think that we need to get our exercise above that to relieve our stress, which is where you get that good feeling from. Essentially, what functional patterns has taught me is that instead of thinking about, okay, my stress is up here, my consumption is up here, let's train above that to try and balance out that equation, is let's actually live a little bit more, without, this might sound a little bit woo-woo, but a little bit closer to nature in terms of our behaviors, so that we can take our stress down, balance our hormones so we're not consuming so much. And then the exercise doesn't need to be as frequent. Once you change the structure of a human and you alter those hormonal imbalances, whereby we're not responding to stress to the point where we're in fight or flight a lot of the time, the actual need to go and fatigue yourself randomly is almost gone. Like and Naudi is talking about this a lot at the moment, in terms of he barely works out, and he's like doing very, very well. He's in fantastic shape. So I think that's the first point that needs to be looked at, is why do we feel that need to go and burn off so much energy? What are we doing in the rest of our life that is causing us to feel that need?
So go on, Alan.
I've just got the quote there. That's brilliant. To not work out and be in fantastic shape. Is that like the golden ticket?
It's in the thing with Naudi, which he's proven in the past, and I've absolutely no doubt that functional patterns will want to prove this. He will lay that out for everybody to follow, and it's only going to gain momentum, or people are only going to believe him. Like at the moment, if you're looking from an outsider and you'll see Naudi saying that online, and you're like, oh yeah, cool, that's a good sales tactic. You don't have to work out and you get in shape. Yeah, that's all it is. But once the practitioners start following that, and then we start hopefully implementing that with our clients, then that's when it goes, oh, there's a lot of people doing this. There's a lot of people that seem to be fairly balanced in their behaviors, seem to be fairly balanced throughout their day. They look like they're in great shape. They claim they're not in any pain, and they don't seem to be doing that much exercise. It's the dream.
So Owen, basically what you're saying is essentially that the way to look at it, if I'm understanding this correctly, is not that exercise is something you should avoid, but it is something that you want to be looking slightly with a wider lens on. So your lens on exercise and fitness shouldn't just be about what you do when you're active. It should actually be about all that time, which is, let's be honest, 98% of the rest of our lives, where we're not necessarily doing structured exercise. That all builds into how effective that 2% of our time is actually spent, or 10% of our time, depending on how active we are. But if we can take into account, like you said there, maybe bringing our stress levels down, looking after ourselves and our well-being, and at the same time with consumption, I'm presuming you're meaning calories, food, alcohol, drugs, etc.
Absolutely.
And bringing that down to a more manageable level, or a level that we actually need on a cell basis, then actually life is more simple. And because of the hormone changes that happen through that, then our exercise becomes more beneficial and are somewhere along the right lines.
Absolutely, yeah. You pretty much nailed it there. I think just being more intentional with what you do. So, okay, I mean, I know several people, and I would say the majority of gym members, it's like you've going to the gym is good. We've been told, I feel like I'm unhealthy, I need to do something about it. I'll go to the gym and I'll do whatever is there, or I'll go and do this exercise. And I just think it needs just a little bit deeper thought to think that term exercise is kind of just a word. It means moving around with some sort of effort. So yeah, I think people just need to think a little bit more deeply about it. When it comes to FP, what I've found is that actually making biomechanical changes, so making structural changes, has a direct influence on your hormonal responses, which then, if you're going to get deep in that, then has a direct influence on the decisions you make and your behaviors, because you're dealing with stress a lot better, meaning that your decision making becomes a lot better, meaning that it's kind of like it comes full circle. Everything comes together at once. Now, you could make changes in other areas of your life before you look at your biomechanics, of course. But I think when you combine the two, when you change your structure and alleviate yourself from pain, and you have your body working a little bit more optimally, it means your hormones are starting to work a little bit more optimally. We're etching our way towards that homeostasis where hormones are acting as they should. Yep, the stress response is there, and it should be activated at certain times, but it should also drop back down. In that, in turn, with making some slightly better decisions in life, for me, that's the key to being a functional human.
I love all this. It's so intriguing, Daryl, to listen to it. I'm just going to bring this back to something I was reading. I was rereading James Clear's Atomic Habits recently, and great book about habits, but does talk about humans wanting instant gratification where things are easy. This doesn't sound easy, Daryl, and that's no disrespect at all. To the normal person who wants to just go to the gym, smash it out, feel better, done, ticked off the list. This is not easy, is it? This is a conscious change, and people sometimes just don't want to have time to research and go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. And those and people are like they're welcome to do that. People do that. They go to the gym and get that ticked off. But my concern is, like, at some point down the road, you're going to come across some sort of issue. And although this may seem like the much harder route, and it is, because it's a seismic change of your whole way of living, even like how you perceive the world. It's from my own personal perspective, on the other side of that is anything you could ever, the balance that you feel in your tissues and in the way you think is like, I could sell that to anybody, honestly. It's phenomenal. But there's no doubt that it's a difficult process. But what I find is that starting by, so let's say somebody is in pain, and they come and see us, instead of trying to maybe preach these sort of things, is we institute like a mechanical driver, if you like, so we will literally change the structure of a person, like literally change the way they look and the way they move, which, whether they like it or not, will change their hormonal responses. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that they're all of a sudden making all these great functional decisions. There's still a lot of mental side to that as well. But I think once you put that in physically to somebody and alter their stress response and give them a few other tips on the side, that it doesn't have to be this huge decision that's made instantly. It's like it almost comes to you because you start to feel better within your body. You're like, actually, it took me a little bit of time to get rid of my injuries and things, but once you start to feel better in your body, those decisions don't really become, it's like, do I want to partake in that? Actually, that's going to make me feel worse. Like, why do I want to do that? I'm on this path where every month that goes by, my body's feeling better and better. I'm getting further away from those pains and dysfunctions I had, which were attached to certain behaviors that I had. I'm like, I don't want to go back to that. It's not a case of like me being strict on myself or me withholding myself from anything. It's like, no, I genuinely don't. I don't want to do that. I want to carry on this path in it because it feels great.
So to get to that stage of what you described there, it takes a lot of self-awareness as well, right? It takes the opportunity for one person to stop and to consider what their habits are, then to consider what kind of pain that they're in, either whether it's psychologically or physiologically, then to start to consider how they address that pain. There's a, as Alan said, there's a real journey there, and that's tough. And we're in a world at the moment where, and we're in this business as PE teachers, where making children and making people active or encouraging them to be active is a really positive thing. Yet what we're finding here is that unless your movement patterns are good and well structured in the way that you move, sometimes that can be detrimental. What could be the negative impact of people maybe overthinking this sort of, right, I need to get out and be active? And what's the argument for sometimes just saying, right, and I know I might not be doing it correctly, I know I might have these aches and pains, but I need to be active and that's good for my health. Where's the sort of balance and the argument between those two?
I think this is the way I see it, and I've heard Naudi touch on this, and this is kind of where I got this. I see it as like maybe like levels. Let's say like levels of health. Let's say, and this is just like an analogy, but let's say it's like 1 to 100. 100 being like optimal health. You're gonna live forever. Okay. I think let's say somebody's sitting at level 5. Now, it might be true enough that going out and just doing whatever to try and get their stress response down, going out and doing any form of exercise, that might get them to level 10. But we're looking like way past that. How can we get humans to like an optimal level of functionality? So let's say like going out for a bike ride, that might enable somebody to lose some weight. So maybe that gets them to like level 15 in terms of health. But like, we think there's a more direct route to get above that. If that kind of makes sense. This is an analogy, and I'm not a massive fan of analogies, but like, I think there's not always just that is wrong. Don't do that. That is wrong. I think it might get you to a certain stage. But like at the moment, our kind of, as a society in the Western world, you would probably look at a human and think, if they live till they're 90 years old, and let's say from the age of 60, 65, they're on medication, you'd be like, that's a pretty good life, pretty good innings, normal, well, maybe past normal, 90 is pretty good, but on some sort of medication to get there. And this is where the different perspective comes in. Functional patterns is like, not happy with that. Like that's not good enough. We want to get to 90 and still be running. We want to be functioning well all the way through our life, which means that you need to be making decent decisions for a large portion of that. So going back to, I think you touched on it there with you two being teachers as well, like trying to implement that to children. I mean, I only found functional patterns when I was 27, 28. Like, and I look back at my life the years before that, and I'm like, geez, like I wish I'd found this when I was a kid. Like, I wonder where I could be just now. And that's, hindsight's a wonderful thing. But yeah, if you could implement that to children, and just the basic concepts of that. I'm not saying everybody has to jump on functional patterns, but this kind of way of thinking, if you like, is a little bit, it was a huge eye opener for me, and just to give them a different perspective on how they can view their life, really.
Do you have any tips, Daryl, for those teachers out there, and on how we can help the kids? Because we see every day we coming in and they're walking into school and their hips are out of line, or you see feet that are slightly out of position, that there's a limp there. And I was unfortunate, Daryl, to spot my son when he was 3 years old with a slightly sort of off gait, and it's only through watching movement that we see that. And he was diagnosed with leg calf Perth disease.
Okay.
Which is obviously where the femur is not fitted into the socket properly. Okay. And the problem with him, I'm trying to get him to do movements and physio to go around it, but for kids it's boring, Daryl. They don't want to do boring functional. They want to be playing and active. So how can we help them but also keep it engaging?
Yeah, that's a great point. And there's a lot of practitioners out there on Instagram, things all over the world, FP practitioners that are doing that are working with kids. And you're right. I think it has to be, I think like anything, it comes down to maybe how it's taught. You know, if the teacher is really passionate about it and they're someone who the child looks up to and respects, then I guess it's all about delivery, like how to deliver that message to the child. It needs to be made enjoyable for sure. And if people could get educated in this stuff, like if the teachers could do the 10-week course and get educated, then what I always think is the results that you feel are what makes you go, oh, this is good. Like, I like this, because you physically, so it almost forces you to go down that path, because it's not just a case of somebody telling you that, oh, this is good for you, do this. Once you start to feel a more structurally sound body, once you start to feel tissues connecting with each other, it's like, oh yeah, this is fun, this is good. Like I like this a lot. I've never worked with young children with it, so specifically how you would implement that with younger children, I'm not absolutely sure on that. But one thing to think about as well is like, and this comes down to kids at school, is like as an animal, how many people in our culture are able to sprint, even if you forget about like good form and good biomechanics and things. How many people in our culture are actually physically able to sprint? Like you take the dog to the park, you let them off the lead, and they're boom, they're sprinting, they're 0 to 100%.
Yeah.
I think to myself, apart from the athletic types, there's really not many. Then you take that into school. I think about when I was at school, you know, you'd maybe have certain types where, I don't know if it wasn't cool to fully exert yourself, and then you think to yourself, you're talking decades upon decades of an animal not going into a full sprint. I mean, if my dog went to the park and after 3 weeks it just wouldn't sprint, I'd be thinking, yep, there's something up with this dog. So I'm like into your adult life. I mean, I'm trying to think to myself, how many adults do I know who can go into a maximum sprint? There's not many.
No, and you know what?
Great point.
What dogs don't do when they go to the park is say to their owner, "Hang on a minute, I'm just going to do a quick warm up before we start this run." You know, and as adults we do, and everything you're saying is becoming much more clear in terms of like contextualizing it.
And then a recovery protocol before they go to the park 3 hours later.
They're just going to take a cold bath, otherwise they're going to be struggling for tomorrow's walk. But you know, we laugh about it, and I know that the science is quite new in all this, Daryl, and I know that a lot of this kind of stuff will have naysayers and pessimists that will say, well, show me the data, show me the research. That's coming, but just from a contextual point of view in terms of teaching, I thought you raised a really good point, and you keep bringing it back to being mammals and humans, which I think is a key part of our conversation today. And you talked about children being inspired and having teachers that care and make a difference. You know, step number one, I think, for any kind of progress is going to be that. And, you know, as a non-teacher yourself, that isn't a pedagogical secret. You know, that's part and parcel of teaching and delivery. I think it's really interesting looking and referring to what Alan just said there about children walking into school, you know, maybe with feet that are externally rotated, maybe with hips that are off, maybe with a poor movement pattern. You'll go to your local park and see a park run and people heel strike in the full 5 kilometers and their bodies and their upper bodies moving in distinct independence to their lower bodies. And you can see these bodies not being used in an efficient manner. And bringing it back to children for a minute, I want to see if maybe I'm simplifying this too much and what your thoughts are on this. If we're teaching children fundamental skills and movements, then this idea of running, throwing, walking, and being in control of their core is really important. And I think the way that I try and get this across to teachers is by looking at a student that you might have, and Alan, I don't know if you'll agree with me with this, that's maybe 9 or 10 that's done gymnastics for 5 years.
Yeah.
You look at a student that has been a gymnast for 5 years by the time they get to 10, 11, and this doesn't necessarily have to be 20 hours a week like some of the more elite athletes, but a gymnast that's been regularly attending really well drilled, really well structured, really entertaining, enjoyable gymnastic sessions. The difference between those children and others when they get to that age, you can see it in their body movements and their control. But I think the key bit we're talking about here and where teachers can start to bring in something that's quite easy with children is body awareness, and is a mind-body connection of being aware of the movements that they're making and why they're making the movements that they're making. Would you agree with that, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, I've got living proof, haven't I, with my kids of a daughter who's, I've got twins, Daryl, and obviously that the comparison is always the case. And I've got a daughter who went through the gym program at the British School Manila where Lewis and I worked, and she's got phenomenal physical literacy. Right? She could turn around to anything, she can move. We were at the park yesterday and she's climbing up rocks and she's just rapid. And I contrast that to my son who couldn't do the gymnastics because he had the Leg-Cal's-Perth disease, and the core is not there and the movement is not there, and he won't mind listening to this and admitting it, because he had a 3-year window of not having functional movement patterns.
Which is an interesting one, Daryl. You'll love this. So the cure to a child's femur not being in its pelvis was to stop that child moving for 3 years and to make sure that was the way that it was treated, which I'm sure from what you've just explained for the last hour, you have your own personal view on.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never came across that specific issue myself, but I guess like we feel, or I feel that functional patterns has a better way of doing things. I've no doubt that this will evolve, and we'll look back in 10 years and say, okay, we've now found a better way than we were doing it 10 years ago. But people are just dealing with the information that they've got at hand, or the information that they think, the information that they've been taught, let's say. So with that, with the treatment being not to move it for 3 years, they're doing the best that they think they can, and they're doing what they think is and what's and it's not like it's not a bad system to have, it's all information that's been passed down, and I personally just feel there's better way to do things. But I definitely wouldn't criticize anybody for that decision.
Oh, not at all. I mean, it was the right medical decision, Daryl, to isolate it, because you have to get the blood flow going to the femur, and he had a physio program. It's just interesting when you don't have that 3 years of moving in a crucial period, how that impacts down the line.
Absolutely.
And what also for me is with this is how individualistic this is. Everybody moves differently, and when we're in a group situation in school, it's catered towards the group. With trying to look at functional movement, you'd be catering 24 different lessons going on, because everybody moves differently. Do you do group sessions, or is it more individualistic where you work?
We do group sessions, and we try and keep the numbers to a minimum for that reason, so we can stay on top of things. And the group sessions are completely different to the one-on-one stuff where it's a little bit more specific, and then we try and take those patterns that we feel like we've coded in, and we take that into a dynamic context in the group, and allow people to kind of feel their way through certain movements. I think with children, and this is just I've got absolutely zero experience working with children to back this up, but I feel like to start with, obviously early on in their life, they're obviously more malleable and more susceptible to have this information inputted into them. So even if it was just a case of like within the group working on things like throwing, with some very basic cues on how to throw the ball, instead of like once we get to the adult stage, like I touched on earlier, it's kind of like reverse engineering the problems that they already have ingrained for decades. So we have to be super, super specific with that. But I think with younger children, as much movement limitations as they have, they haven't had the decade upon decade of hammering those in. So even if it was just a case of possibly going through some activities where we're learning how to throw the ball reasonably well, and incorporating some running and things, just some short running, just going through those movements, I think would help at a younger age.
Yeah, and also, Daryl, you think about this last year where they've been sat on a device for the vast majority of their sort of their day. And I know my kids are not through any fault of their own. They've got online school. They're spending 7 hours plus sat on a device. How does that really affect them anatomically? Because we're going to have a lot of parents listening to this who want to know now how can we now reposition them, because they're hunched over, their hips are all over the place. What can parents do to help their kids who have been sat for large
It's a great point. I think one thing to be aware of that comes with that is the actual the blue light you're getting from the screen itself. If you could, I mean, if those things have to be done, if it could be done in an area where you're either outside or you're getting some sort of natural light in your eyes as well, like the damage that can have in your physiology, that's a completely different conversation, and it's a huge conversation to be had as well. But in terms of like their physical posture when they're doing that, that's the problem, is the fact that the seated position, it's like, it's not necessarily the position that's the problem. It's the fact that we're adapting to that position, usually through taking on forms of stress in that position. So if you think about our stress response, it's there to keep us safe. So we come into some sort of danger. Every energy in our body is sent to our muscles so that we can run or we can fight. Okay. We're now sat at a desk, we're engaged in work. It's actually, and we're taking stressors from our environment as well. So we're still feeling those levels of stress. Our stress response still works the same way, except that we're not running away from that. We're just sitting in that seated position and taking that. So our muscles are literally taking that stress in that position, and we're adapting to that position. The example would be, again, going back to dogs. You take the dog back from the park, it goes straight onto the couch or its bed, and it'll lie there for a couple of hours. It gets up, it goes to the park, and it sprints again. So I think a bigger question to ask wouldn't be necessarily what position are they sitting in. Like, sure, you could ask them to get up every now and again and move around, but more so like, how can we make sure that the majority of their time is spent either in a more natural environment or not stressing over things that are causing them to have these issues in their body. So and that's going way deeper than just asking them to get up and move around. But if we can get their physiology to not be stressed in those positions, whether that be from external factors like your blue light, or the fact that they're stressed with what it is they're actually doing, and give them a better outlook on actually how to behave in terms of their health, like some really simple things, like just getting outside a lot more, like just getting outside, not being stuck indoors whilst we're on these devices. I know that the work has to get done, but if we can add those sorts of things into their daily routine, setting certain time limits on these devices, and trying to have a more well-rounded approach to their whole day, to essentially look at it from a health perspective, not just necessarily the posture that they're sitting in whilst they're doing it.
Yeah, I think
I rambled on a little bit there, but
it does. But it comes back to that same sort of message that you've sent throughout our conversation here, Daryl, which is around you're not trying to necessarily hone in, and if it is posture, as Alan's example, posture on a chair, you're not trying to fix the posture by being conscious and changing your posture as you're sitting. You're actually looking at all those other factors that sort of amalgamate towards the result that you've got there. So you're not necessarily just trying to make a diagnosis based on curing the symptoms. You actually look at trying to adjust the other parts around that then have a knock-on effect onto it.
Exactly, and this is why it's quite a difficult sell to sell functional patterns, because Alan could ask that question to another modality, and they may say, here's a quick fix. I don't know, sit with a cushion in a certain position, and that'll fix your issue.
And that's what people want, Daryl. They want a quick fix, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a quick, easy, but is it a fix, or is it just catering to that? Okay, I'll do that because that's an easy. Our sell with functional patterns is so much more difficult, because you ask me that question and I ask you to look at the behaviors of the human. So it's like, well, wait a minute, what? Like, I'm asking you how to improve the posture when I'm sat on a device, and you're telling me I need to get up in the morning and get outside and change my whole behavior. And it's like, yeah, like that's the message I'm trying to get across is our behavior on a second by second daily basis needs to change, so that our physiology will change, so that we're not adapting to these positions because we're under so much stress.
Yeah, and you can pick that in a myriad of examples. Going back to the sort of gym one, well, I want to go to the gym, okay, but I don't go after work because I'm tired. Okay, why are you tired? I don't really have enough sleep. Well, okay, what do you eat during the day? Well, I skip lunch because I'm busy. Well, you're never going to get to the gym after work because you've not had enough sleep and you've not actually taken on enough nutrients to actually feel like you want to. And it brings us back to that sort of zombie idea that you came at earlier. And before we wind down, I just want to explore that a little bit and just give us some sort of idea on the kind of things or the kind of approach that you're having to life, and some maybe FP people and clients are, that sort of looks away from what everybody's following. So I can see, for example, you talked about blue light and you've got a red light bulb just behind your head. I know that you've experimented with fasting. Can you tell us a little bit about some of these things? Why on earth you've tried some of them? Because there's some that I certainly probably wouldn't be queuing up to try myself, and what kind of impact they've had on you.
Absolutely. Everything that I've tried and learned has came through functional patterns, and they've pointed me in the direction of other people like this guy, Dr. Jack Cruz. And for me, it's like I just test these things. Like, okay, it's like a little criteria that I have in my head. One, does it make sense? Like, is what this person's saying, does it have any sort of like, does it make common sense to me? And I'm like, yeah, that actually makes some sense. Okay, let's try it. Let's actually try it. And then it's like, did it work? Did you feel any benefit from it? And that's kind of like the criteria I go through. And it's easy enough to do that. It's like the things that I've said today, just, test it out. But there is I definitely say the way that I live my life, and a lot of other FP practitioners live life, is definitely outside the norm. And there's probably things that I'll forget here that just seem normal to me now, but we're very much focused on trying to set a circadian rhythm. So we have like a circadian clock, which should be governed by the sun. So when the sun comes up in the morning, that should tell your tissues it's time to go. when the sun sets at evening, it should be time to go to sleep. Your cells should be governed from that action. That should be your clock. Now, obviously, we have jobs to get to. We have to live in an unnatural environment, and I get that. I'm not saying we all need to go and live back in the woods, but there's little protocols that I use, which I've learned from the people I mentioned, and things like the first thing I do, if you can get up in the morning and see the sunrise, make the sunrise the first light that hits your eyes and hits your tissues. I guess people still do this, but I haven't done this for so many years. I think a lot of people, the first thing they do is look at their phone, or they'll maybe switch on a house light. So the very first light they're getting is that artificial blue spike. So if you can get outside and watch the sunrise, if that's not possible to you for timings and work and things, the whole day can be spent just trying to get as much natural light in your life as possible. So trying to be outside whenever you can, going several steps further than that, which we do at nighttime. In my house, there's no blue light. There's no of your traditional lighting. We have some red lights which would mimic fire. So if you could have some candles and things, it's probably better. But we just have some red lights in the house, which and it's all geared towards essentially getting better sleep. I think as a society, again, we somehow have forgotten of what we actually need to be healthy, and sleep is there. I was speaking to somebody the other day, and they said like, oh yeah, I've heard that's like pretty good for you if you get more sleep. And I'm like, yeah, it's sleep. Like it's there for it's like every other animal on the planet is not cutting their sleep short. So everything that I do in terms of the light environment, and not eating after a certain time at night. I try not to eat, on a rough rule of thumb, try not to eat after the sun's gone down. And we do some other crazy stuff like turning off the Wi-Fi at nighttime. It's all geared towards getting better sleep. And until you experience this, until you give this like let's say a 3-week shot and you start sleeping better, it's absolutely profound the effect that has on your health. If somebody had asked me 5 years ago, do you sleep well? I would have said, yeah, I think so. I think I sleep pretty well. It's not until you get good quality sleep that you go, oh, well, I was not sleeping before. That wasn't sleep. What I'm getting now is that sleep. I wake up in the morning and I feel completely recharged, completely re-energized. I'm ready to attack the day. I feel energized by my sleep. So all these protocols that I follow, and there's so many. You mentioned fasting as well, which is something I just experimented with again, and just thought, let's test it out. And again, it's worked wonders for me. Whether that's for everybody, I don't know, but I definitely think people could do with eating less. That's for sure. But all these protocols, if I was to simplify it, it's really just geared towards getting good quality sleep. I think that is ultimately one of the most fundamental pieces of the puzzle.
Where does caffeine and alcohol fit into that, Daryl? Do they things you tend to avoid completely, or?
Yeah. Try to. Again, I kind of touched on it earlier. Like a lot of these decisions for me, they're not something that I and people quite often ask me this with diet and things as well. It's not like I am being strict with myself. It's not like I'm like, oh, I really do want that, but I'm just not going to do it because I know it's not good for my health. It's way deeper than that. It's like I feel improving your health and improving your sleep. I feel that great that I'm like, and it seems to be improving that feeling. I'm like, that thing, that coffee or that food or whatever, it's actually not appealing to me. It's not that I'm having to avoid it or anything. It's like, yeah, that doesn't actually appeal to me. Something that fuels my body in it makes me feel good will actually taste really good to me, and something that doesn't, it's definitely not like a choice I have to make anymore. It's just that it's like it's physically been implanted in my body, that I feel that good, that I'm like, yeah, that's an easy decision to bypass that.
That's a change that's been constant but massive over the last 6-7 years then.
Huge, like even shorter than that. Like it's a huge change. Like people talk about not being able to, some people will never change. I have, like, not only physically have I changed as a person, like my structure's changed, but like the decisions I make on a second by second basis, I am literally a completely different person. Like I was just, I wasn't into any of this just a few years ago. I was just your regular guy. Played football, one of the lads. Just, I can't emphasize enough how much it's changed my perspective on life, I guess.
And all positive benefits. Have you seen anything that has been tough or that's been negative along that journey?
There's definitely, it's all, there's definitely things that might appear difficult to some people in terms of like the social aspect to that. So I think if our society was more geared towards being like more geared towards functionality in terms of instead of socializing, and like I'm all for socializing, but does that socializing bring something to your life? Like does it enhance what you're doing, or is it just kind of like, for a lot of people it's actually doing the opposite? It's detrimental to their health and things. But I guess the difficult thing with this path would be you end up not partaking in the normal social things that people do, and it's again, it's like trying to, I think you guys are, your podcast and things is about leading, and that for me is like my challenge is to try and show people. So it's, these things are great where like we can get on it and talk about the whys behind what we do, but like I want it to be, and this is getting led from Naudi at the top, and he's kind of like put this into me as well, is I want the people around me and the people that I do socialize with to look at me and go, shit, like he's like that's why I want to be like. He's 45, he's 50, he's moving way better than us. He's not got all these aches and pains going on that we're talking about. It's actually starting to bore me now, all the other stuff. I just want to get my body good. I want to like follow this guy's path. So I think it has to be shown first. It's all good me talking about these things, but if functional patterns as a community, if you like, can actually physically show people that, whoa, these guys look like they're having a good time. They feel really great into their 50s, 60s, 70s. Then it's like, okay, there might be something to this,
Certainly is. Proof is in the pudding, isn't it? As the expression goes. We're going to wind it down now, Daryl, and we're going to ask one of my favourite questions. We're going to have a bit of fun with it.
Yep.
We just touched upon leaders there. Give us your 3 leaders you'd love to go out for a meal with. They could be dead or alive. Could be anybody you wish. 3 leaders to go out with.
3 leaders. I would take Naudi Aguilar as my first one, and from my football background, I would say Roy Keane. He really fits a lot of my sort of like beliefs and things, especially in that sport. But I feel like he'd be a really interesting guy to speak to.
I'd love to see the conversation he'd have about functional movement. Yeah, he'd have a right Barney with him. He'd chin you, I think. And the third one, I guess I actually read his book on leadership, and going down the same sort of, my background is obviously football, so I'll go Alex Ferguson. I really enjoyed his book on
decision making. I thought there were some really interesting points in that.
Yeah, there's the book Leading. It's a really good one.
Yeah,
cracking book. On books, I've got one for you, Daryl. What have you read recently that's good? Whether it's a little bit left field and a little bit out of people's comfort zones, or whether it's something a bit more mainstream.
I mean, I've got a couple of books on the go at the moment. One is about water and things and all these other sorts of strange stuff. But one thing that the main book that is recommended by Functional Patterns to learn this way of thinking, if you like, is a book called The Tyranny of Words. And if you were to read that book, you'd be like, what? This is nothing to do with biomechanics or movement or exercise at all. But it's literally that. It's a book on words and a book on semantics. And once you read that, or this is my experience anyway, I read that book and that was the red pill, if you like. That was the like, oh wow, like we're all kind of playing these games around words, and especially in the industry that I'm in, the fitness industry. That was a huge eye opener. That book, The Tyranny of Words by Stuart Chase. It just, if I was to give you like a quick rundown of how how I perceived it in my industry, it's like a lot of training systems are built around words. So like let's say strength, right? It's a really popular thing in the fitness industry. We're gonna build your strength, but it's so contextual, that word, that how does that apply? I mean, you could have a guy that squats 200 kilograms in the weight room. General consensus would be pretty strong guy. He then goes into the park and does the most fundamental movement a human could do and runs, and he tears his hamstring. My opinion, weak structure. So where's the strength? That's two opposite things I've said there, strength and weakness, and yet it's applying to the same. So that book is just literally a book on words, but it made me look at my industry and I'm like, right, all these kind of things that these ideas that people are pushing, and we've got whole, industries and things built upon them. I'm like, yeah, that's just words. Like there's so much context applied to that you can't just say we're ultimately improving somebody's strength, or we're be more flexible. That guy needs more flexibility. Like what does that mean? Like specifically, what does that mean? So yeah, that book would be it's an awesome read.
Well, we'll add that to the list, Lewis. I think everything at the moment that we're hearing on the podcast is that the context provides the narrative. Is that right, Lewis?
Yeah, definitely. And I think what Daryl's really conceptualized throughout this whole conversation is that, pick a training program or a training sort of system that suits you, but bear in mind the impact that has on your wider life, and the wider life and the impact that has on the training system that you're choosing. And although we're talking about functional patterns as a training system in many respects, it does take into account and it does allow respect for everything around it that feeds into it, and that happens both ways. And I think you've been really clear in getting that message across, Daryl. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Cool. I've really enjoyed it as well, guys. Thank you.
Daryl, just before we wrap up, can you tell us where people can read more about the work you're doing and the great stuff you're doing at FP Perth, and also a little bit more about the background of FP and where they can get involved?
Yep. So my website is functionalpatternsperth.com, and the Instagram, which is where you'll kind of see all the more recent stuff that we get up to, is FP_Perth. You could the main website for Functional Patterns is just functionalpatterns.com, and it's got loads of info on it, loads of good videos and things, but also loads of really interesting fitness equipment, different tools that aren't often used in the rest of the industry. So it's really worth having a look. And they obviously have an Instagram as well, Functional Patterns Instagram. Yeah, I would check those out for sure.
And a good place to start is the 10-week course. Is that right?
10-week course. Yeah, that's the best place to start. If you lived in the vicinity of a functional patterns practitioner, then that's doing that with the 10-week course is that's ideal.
And a personal plug for Daryl. I had some online sessions with Daryl through lockdown, and they were absolutely superb, and I made a hell of a lot of progress in terms of pain management. So thanks for that on a personal note, Daryl. And yeah, he practices what he preaches, and he's a great instructor. Guys, search Infinite Leaders Live on YouTube and IGTV and theinfinitelearners.com. We're on Twitter. We're always up for a conversation, and your feedback, whether that's constructive or whether that's for praise, please click subscribe. Please leave us a review, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Daryl.
Thank you.